When we think of Rome and Sparta, it's easy to picture them as two superpowers of the ancient world. Formidable armies, iron discipline, and deep influence on military history. It would seem logical to assume they must have crossed swords at some point. But the reality is far more interesting. There was never a war between Rome and Sparta. Why not? To answer that, the first thing we need to understand is that although both civilizations existed during overlapping periods, their peaks of power did not coincide. Sparta reached its military height in the 5th century BCE, during the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War, when it defeated the mighty Persian Empire at Thermopylae and later overcame Athens. At that time, Rome was just another city-state in central Italy, without power comparable to that of the Greek polis. While Sparta dominated the Greek world, Rome was still struggling for survival against neighboring tribes such as the Etruscans, the Sabines, and the Samnites. Rome's true rise didn't begin until well into the 4th century BCE, and its major expansion across the Mediterranean came in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, by which time Sparta was no longer a hegemonic power. By the time Rome began looking toward Greece with imperial ambitions, Sparta was a shadow of its former self. Its institutions were in decline, its army was a fraction of what it had once been, and its role in Greek politics had been reduced to a marginal, though still symbolic, figure. This brings us to a key truth. Rome and Sparta were never enemies because they were never true rivals on the same historical stage. They were never in comparable positions of power at the same time. Their histories brush against each other, but they never clash. However, that doesn't mean there was no contact. Later in the script, we'll explore how Rome reached Greece and how it regarded Sparta. But the fundamental reason behind this absence of conflict lies in the time gap between the two powers. Rome didn't fight Sparta because, by the time Rome was ready to conquer Greece, Sparta was no longer a serious military obstacle. The great city of Leonidas, and Lycurgus, could no longer challenge Roman legions. It was a proud city, yes, but more important for its myth than for its muscle. In the collective imagination, Sparta is synonymous with strength, discipline, and war. Its name still echoes as that of an indomitable city, shaped by centuries of military preparation. However, by the time Rome began to emerge as a dominant force in the Mediterranean, Sparta was no longer roaring. It was sleeping. After its victory over Athens in the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, Sparta reached the peak of its power. For a brief time, it was the most influential city in all of Greece. But that supremacy was short-lived. Internally, its rigid social system, based on a minority of Spartiates, citizen soldiers, ruling over a majority of enslaved helots, began to crack. Constant warfare, the loss of citizens, and a lack of political flexibility weakened Sparta. From the 4th century BC onward, its power declined significantly. It was defeated by Thebes at the Battle of Leuctra, 371 BCE, a devastating blow that marked the beginning of its military downfall. From that point on, Sparta was never again a superpower. By the 3rd century BCE, while Rome was fighting the Punic Wars against Carthage, Sparta occupied a marginal position, politically and militarily isolated from the rest of Greece. In a desperate attempt to regain lost glory, some Spartan kings like Cleomenes III tried to reform the social system and revitalize the army. However, these efforts came too late and were poorly received by other Greek cities, generating even more instability. At this point, Sparta was no longer feared, but respected out of tradition. Its military structure was still impressive on paper, and its discipline remained admired, but real power, the kind that moved armies, conquered territories, and controlled allies, was no longer in its hands. And perhaps most revealing, when Rome finally intervened in Greek affairs, it did not see Sparta as a threat. The true Greek powers at that time were cities like Corinth and Athens, or leagues like the Achaean League and the Aetolian League. Sparta, by contrast, was a nostalgic symbol of a bygone era, a lion that once roared fiercely but now slumbered among ruins and obsolete traditions. Thus, when the fate of Greece hung by a thread and Rome prepared to dominate it, Sparta lacked both the strength and unity to resist, let alone to declare war on a Rome that was conquering kingdoms like Macedon and destroying empires like Carthage. Contrary to what one might expect from such a warlike republic and later empire, as Rome, its relationship with the Greek world was ambiguous, fascinating, and deeply contradictory. On one hand, Rome would eventually subjugate almost all of the Greek city-states. On the other, it never stopped admiring them. From very early on, the Romans saw Greece as a source of wisdom, art, philosophy, and culture. The education of young upper-class Romans was based on Greek authors. Greek philosophers, doctors, and teachers were hired by the most influential Roman families. Even in the military, the Romans adopted tactics and formations inspired by the ancient hoplites. Rome was not indifferent to the glorious history of Sparta, nor to that of Athens. But here's a key detail. Rome admired more than it feared. Greek culture became a model to follow, and in many ways, the Romans were its cultural heirs, even while they politically subdued it. In Sparta's specific case, its austerity, discipline, and devotion to duty were qualities the Romans deeply respected. In fact, many Roman senators saw in the ancient Spartans a reflection of the virtues they themselves aspired to uphold: bravery, loyalty to the state, and disdain for luxury. Although imperial Rome would eventually embrace power and ostentation, the image of the ideal Roman citizen had much in common with the Spartan ethos. So why was there no war between Rome and Sparta? Because Rome did not see Sparta as a rival to defeat, but rather as an honorable relic of a past they admired. With other Greek cities like Corinth or Pergamon, the approach was harsher because they represented real centers of resistance. But Sparta was seen almost as a living shrine of ancient virtues. Even when Rome began to intervene militarily in Greece, first against Philip V of Macedon and later against the Achaean League, Sparta was neither the main target nor the declared enemy. Instead, it was treated as an isolated city, somewhat proud but lacking strategic importance. Rome's respect for Greece, and especially for certain aspects of its culture, explains why the Roman conquest was so deeply influenced by the Greek world, to the point that it is often said, Greece conquered Rome, but through culture. By this point in the script, we've seen that Rome didn't fight Sparta because, quite simply, it wasn't necessary. But that doesn't mean they never came face to face. Rome did arrive in Sparta, though not with drawn swords, but rather with more pragmatic and political approach. To understand how that encounter unfolded, we need to situate ourselves in the 2nd century BCE. By then, Rome was already an undisputed power in the Western Mediterranean and had begun to intervene decisively in Greek affairs. Specifically, Rome became involved in the wars against Macedonia and in internal conflicts among the Greek cities themselves. Sparta, though weakened, was still a problem for its neighbors. At the time, the main political organization in the region was the Achaean League, a confederation of cities in the Peloponnese that sought to unify Greece under its leadership and saw Sparta as a thorn in its side. Sparta resisted joining this league, defending its independence with the pride it was known for. The situation escalated in 146 BCE, when the Achaean League went to war against Rome. Ironically, Sparta did not directly participate in this war, but it was still a factor that intensified the conflict. Its tensions with the Achaeans were among the many reasons Rome cited for its intervention in Greece. And what happened? Rome crushed the Achaean League with little difficulty. The final battle took place in Corinth, and its outcome was brutal. The city was sacked and destroyed by the Roman general Lucius Mummius. It was a clear message to all of Greece. Rome was now in charge. And Sparta? Sparta was treated differently. It wasn't destroyed, sacked, or harshly punished. Instead, Rome recognized it as a separate entity, independent from the Achaean League, something the Spartans had long desired. In a way, Rome rewarded Sparta for staying out of the main conflict. That doesn't mean Sparta regained its former glory. It no longer had the power to act as an independent force, and gradually fell under Roman influence, like the rest of the Greek world. But Rome respected its local autonomy and did not impose a direct military administration as it did in other rebellious cities. It's ironic. Sparta, famed for its warrior spirit, was one of the few Greek cities that didn't need to face Rome in battle. Even more curious, its long-standing refusal to join Greek alliances, which for centuries have been seen as stubbornness, ended up working in its favor. The Romans took advantage of that division to dominate Greece. In short, when Rome arrived in Sparta, it didn't find an enemy. It found a proud remnant of a glorious past. What Rome did was simply integrate it into the new order, without destroying it, without humiliating it, almost as if paying tribute to its legend. Let's imagine, for a moment, a different world. One where Rome and Sparta did face off. What would have happened if, instead of encountering a weakened Sparta, Rome had to confront the Sparta of Leonidas, of Agesilaus, of the 300? To explore this alternate history, we must place both powers at the height of their military strength. Sparta in the 5th century BCE, during the Peloponnesian War, and Rome in the 2nd century BCE, when its legions were nearly unstoppable. Trident emblem the Spartan army at its peak. Sparta didn't have a large population, but its training system, the agoge, produced fearsome soldiers. The Spartan army was built around a hoplite phalanx, a wall of shields and long spears in tight formation, nearly impossible to break head-on if well-positioned. Moreover, Spartans didn't fear death. Their mindset was forged on the idea of dying in battle for their city. They were extremely disciplined, resistant to pain, and experts in heavy infantry tactics. But they had a weakness. They were few in number, and their societal model was inflexible. Each Spartan was a professional warrior, but that also meant they couldn't afford large casualties without endangering the survival of their state. Shield the Roman army, a war machine. On the other side, we have Rome, with its legions organized into maniples and centuries of experience fighting a wide array of enemies. Celts, Iberians, Greeks, Carthaginians, Macedonians. The Romans were experts in adapting, learning, and applying new tactics quickly. Their military system was more professional and larger in scale. The Roman legion was more flexible than a phalanx, giving an edge in irregular terrain or rapid maneuvers. Furthermore, Rome could sustain long wars. It had resources, human reserves, logistics, and an imperial strategy. Crossed swords, what they had fought. If Rome had clashed with Sparta at its height, the outcome would heavily depend on the context. In a single battle, on terrain favorable to the phalanx, and with Sparta leading a Greek coalition, it could have dealt a major blow to Rome. But in a prolonged war, Rome almost certainly would have won. Its ability to recover, adapt, lay sieges, cut supply lines, and crush allies one by one would have been overwhelming. Rome didn't just win battles, it won entire wars. Most likely, Sparta would have resisted bravely, defeated legions in open battle, and still ended up besieged, weakened, and eventually absorbed. It might have ended like Carthage, destroyed, or like Macedonia, turned into a province. But it's also possible that, after a major battle, Rome would have offered a pact of respect and partial submission, similar to what it did with many Greek cities. In that case, Sparta might have retained some autonomy under Rome's shadow. Globe showing Europe, Africa, what does this thought experiment tell us? This alternate scenario reveals something fascinating. Sparta and Rome shared a similar mindset, despite having very different social models. Both valued discipline, duty, and military glory. At their core, they were peoples who would have respected each other, even as enemies. That's why, although they never fought, it's not hard to imagine a duel between them as one of the most epic clashes in ancient history. A battle of titans that never happened in reality, but that lives on vividly in the imagination of history lovers. Although they never crossed swords, Sparta and Rome profoundly influence each other, like two mirrors separated by time, reflecting similar ideas about duty, war, and sacrifice. While Rome never fought against Sparta, it did inherit part of its spirit, and that was etched into the history of the West. Classical building, a tacit admiration. The Romans were practical, but also deeply symbolic. They respected the past, especially when it represented values they themselves promoted. In Sparta, they saw an austere, disciplined, brave civilization, and above all, one oriented toward the survival of the state over the individual. This was not too different from the Roman ideal of mos maiorum, the tradition of the ancestors, personal sacrifice for the homeland, and civic virtue. Writers like Plutarch, though Greek, wrote for a Roman audience and helped consolidate the Spartan myth within Rome. The stories of Leonidas and his 300 resonated with Roman ideals about courage in the face of death. Even emperors like Julian the Apostate and Marcus Aurelius were inspired by Spartan models of conduct for their way of life and governance. Balanced scale, the law above the individual. Sparta was governed by a harsh system of laws, attributed to the mythical legislator Lycurgus. The idea that the law was immutable and must be obeyed without question was very similar to the Roman legalistic view. While Roman law was more sophisticated and expansive, the notion of absolute obedience to the established order was common to both worlds. In both cases, the individual was less important than the collective. The citizen had to live for the city, not the other way around. Sparta applied this from birth, with strict upbringing. Rome applied it in the forum, in the military, and in politics. Shield the military spirit. Militarily, Rome did not literally copy the Spartan phalanx that was already obsolete by the time Rome expanded, but it adopted and adapted the spirit of professionalism and military discipline that the Spartans embodied. Constant training, hierarchical organization, and pride in the uniform were common traits. Roman legions were different in form, but similar in substance. Soldiers trained to endure, obey, and fight as one. The difference was that Rome knew how to scale this idea to an empire. Sparta never could.